They told you Vikings were raiders, explorers, warriors chasing silver and glory, but they buried something else in those shipholds, something that built their cities and powered their fleets. 821. Howth, the Annals of Ulster. Name the year, name the place. Heathens plundered the coast north of Dublin and carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not cattle, not coin, women. The Chronicle knows what mattered. 30 years later, another raid, same waters, 3,000 people captured in a single attack, children, wives, mothers pulled from doorways and dragged to ships. This was not random violence, this was commerce. The largest slave trade in medieval Europe ran on Viking ships, and women were the currency that never depreciated. If you value documented history and archaeological truth like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Ben Raffield's 2019 study in the journal Slavery and Abolition, which details archaeological finds of iron shackles at Dublin, Birka, and Hedeby, and from the Cambridge Archaeological Journal's 2021 article analyzing Ibn Fadlan's 10th century eyewitness account of Viking funeral practices, published by Cambridge University Press. Now back to the information. Who bought them? Where did they go? What happened in those market squares in Dublin and Hedeby where human beings were priced in ounces of silver? The sagas won't tell you. The runestones stay silent, but the bones talk. The DNA talks. The trade routes carved into river mud and harbor pylons talk. And what they say is this: Viking expansion was a slave economy, and noble mothers, nuns from monasteries, daughters of kings, they were the most valuable merchandise of all. Dublin. 41. The Vikings established their first permanent base on Irish soil, not just a raiding post, a city. By 850, it is one of the most important slave trading hubs in the entire North Atlantic. Wooden wharves stretch into the Liffey, ships from Norway, Sweden, the Rus territories, all converging. Archaeological excavations have recovered iron neck collars and leg shackles from the harbor area. 6 separate finds in the town center. They look exactly like restraints used on human captives in every other slave society from Rome to Renaissance Italy. Some archaeologists argued they were for animals, livestock restraints, but iron collars do not concentrate in harbors unless you are loading and unloading human cargo. And Dublin had no livestock industry that would justify this density of finds. The annals tell us Viking leaders quickly learned to ransom high-status captives. Kings, bishops, anyone who could pay. From the 830s onward, prominent figures were seized and either released for silver or killed at the ships if negotiations failed. But women were different. Women did not need ransom. Women were the inventory. A female captive in early medieval Ireland was called a cumul. The word meant both the woman herself and her value as a unit of currency. 3 ounces of silver, 8 to 10 cows, 1 cumul. That is what a woman was worth, not metaphorically. Legally, in Irish Brehon law, land, cattle, and slaves were measured in cumhalla. A standard cumul of land was about 14 hectares. 3 milch cows equaled 1 cumul. 1 ounce of silver equaled 1/3 of a cumul. The entire economic system used enslaved women as the base unit. Female slaves were so central to the Irish economy that their name became the word for value itself. When Vikings raided, they knew what they were taking. The life of St. Findon, written in the late 9th century, always preserves one man's account. Findon, a noble from Leinster, went to ransom his sister who had been captured by Vikings. Things went badly. Findon himself was seized, though some Vikings argued it was wrong to capture negotiators, and he was released. Later, he was captured again and carried to the Orkney Islands. The account notes an Irish conspirator helped in his second capture. Political alliances between Vikings and Irish are recorded from the 840s. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Irish kings were gathering captives as war booty to sell in the same slave markets the Vikings had built. Hedeby, southern Denmark, 948. Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal describes a Viking slave trade stretching across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Hedeby is one of the nodes. Archaeological work in the harbor recovered 5 iron shackles, 5 separate restraints for human beings in a single excavation area near the wharves. The harbor, where ships dock, where cargo transfers. Captives were sold directly from the ships or held in nearby properties and brought to the waterfront when buyers arrived. The town had no purpose-built slave market. It did not need one. Trade happened in open spaces, on wharves, in the shadow of merchant halls. Silver flowed in exchange for people. Hordes of Arab dirhams have been found across Scandinavia, coins minted in Samarkand, Tashkent, Balkh. The eastern trade routes were slave routes. The Swedish Rus operated trading posts in what is now Russia and Ukraine, Novgorod. Or High Street intersected Slave Street. That is not legend, that is archaeology. Street names preserved in settlement patterns. The word slave itself comes from Slav. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were raided so systematically that their ethnic name became the term for human chattel in multiple languages, but the British Isles supplied the highest volume. The Annals of Ulster record Viking raids on Irish monasteries, coastal settlements, and inland towns throughout the 9th century. Women and children were the primary targets. Men of fighting age were often killed outright. Women and children could be transported, controlled, sold. The 8th of May, 950. By then, an estimated 15% of the population of Western Europe were slaves. 15%. Viking cities like Dublin and Limerick were economic hubs because of it. Without the slave trade, these settlements would not have achieved their wealth or size. Who were they taking? The chronicles name women, great numbers of women, but what kind of women? Peasants? Nobility? The DNA evidence from Iceland provides one answer. Modern genetic studies of the Icelandic population show that up to 2/3 of Iceland's founding female population had Gaelic origins. Ireland, Scotland, the northwestern British Isles, but only 1/3 of the male founding population was Gaelic. The rest were Norse. The reverse pattern. Norse men, Gaelic women. The conclusion is unavoidable. Nordic men settled Iceland with women they brought from raids on the British Isles. Some of these women may have gone voluntarily. Some may have been wives in legitimate marriages. But the overwhelming genetic signal, combined with historical records of systematic raiding, suggests a large percentage were slaves. Laxdæla saga preserves a story about an Irish princess named Melkorka brought to Iceland as a slave. She pretended to be mute. Only after she bore a child to her owner was her noble lineage discovered. The saga treats this as exotic romance, a 13th century fantasy about a beautiful foreign princess. But strip away the literary embellishment, and you have the skeleton of historical practice. High-status women from Ireland and Scotland were taken as slaves and forced into sexual relationships with their captors. The sagas call them concubines. The Icelandic law code Gragas states explicitly that a man could purchase a slave for the purpose of sexual pleasure. Not hidden, not shameful, legal. Neil Price, archaeologist at Uppsala University, estimates that slaves comprised as much as 25% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age. 1 in 4 people. The entire social structure depended on forced labor. The fleet depended on it. Each Viking ship needed at least one massive woolen sail. Some needed 2. A single 90 square meter sail could take one person up to 5 years to produce. Wool production, shearing, spinning, weaving, every step labor intensive, with hundreds of ships in the fleet. The demand for sails was enormous. Neil Price argues that the need for slave labor to produce sails may have begun as early as the Vendel period, 550 to 790. Before the Viking Age even started, before Lindisfarne, before the Great Raids, Scandinavian society was already building an economy around captive labor, and women were the producers. Textile work in Scandinavia was strongly gendered. Women spun, women wove. A skilled female weaver was worth more than an unskilled male laborer. Viking raiders knew this. When they targeted women in raids, they were not just satisfying sexual demand, they were acquiring skilled labor. Ben Raffield, archaeologist at Uppsala, notes that in slaving contexts across history, women are often taken because they produce high-value goods, textiles, pottery, food processing. The assumption that male slaves are more valuable for labor is wrong. Female slaves were essential to the economic engine, but not all female slaves were treated equally. Status before capture mattered. A peasant woman and a noblewoman did not have the same value. The Icelandic sagas give hints. In Laxdæla saga, a merchant named Höskuldur purchases Melkorka for 3 marks of silver, but the merchant had other female slaves for sale at 1 mark each, triple the price. Why? The text implies her beauty, her bearing. Something about her signaled higher status. The saga later reveals she was an Irish princess. If this story has any historical basis, it shows that slave traders could identify and price women based on perceived nobility. Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan provides the most detailed contemporary account of what happened to female slaves in Viking society, 922. The Volga River, Ibn Fadlan, an envoy from Baghdad to the Volga Bulgars, encounters a group of Rus traders. Swedish Vikings or their descendants. He watches them for weeks, takes notes. What he describes is shocking even by the standards of his time. He witnesses the funeral of a wealthy Rus chieftain. The dead man's property is divided into 3 parts, 1/3 to his family, 1/3 for funeral clothes, 1/3 for nabid, an intoxicating drink. Then the slave women and servants are asked, which of you wants to die with him? One slave girl volunteers. From that moment, 2 other female servants guard her constantly. They wash her feet with their own hands. The girl drinks every day and sings. 10 days of preparation. The day arrives. The chieftain's body is exhumed from its temporary grave and dressed in the funeral clothes. He is placed on a ship on land, surrounded by weapons, food, drink. Animals are sacrificed. A dog cut in half. 2 horses, 2 cows, a rooster, a hen. The pieces are thrown onto the ship. Then the slave girl is brought to the ship. She drinks a cup of intoxicating liquid, sings, drinks another cup, sings. The old woman called the angel of death incites her to drink more. The girl is drunk. Disoriented, she is lifted 3 times over a wooden doorframe. Each time she says what she sees in the afterlife, her father, her mother, her master beckoning. Then 6 men enter a tent on the ship with her, one after another. Each man has intercourse with her. Each man says, "Tell your master I did this out of love for you. This is not intercourse. This is rape." The girl is a slave. She cannot consent. She is intoxicated to the point of confusion. 6 men, in sequence, while the funeral waits. After this, the girl is brought onto the ship. The angel of death and another woman accompany her into a pavilion where the dead chieftain lies. Outside, men begin beating shields with sticks. The noise is deafening. Ibn Fadlan says they do this so her screams will not discourage other slaves from volunteering in the future. The angel of death wraps a rope around the girl's neck. 2 men pull it tight on either side. The angel of death stabs her repeatedly with a broad-bladed dagger. Between the ribs, over and over, the slave girl is strangled and stabbed to death. Then the ship is set on fire. Everything burns. The chieftain, the slave, the animals, the grave goods, all reduced to ash. This account appears in Ibn Fadlan's Risala, his travel narrative. Scholars have debated its reliability. Ibn Fadlan was Muslim. He viewed Norse religious practices through the lens of his own faith. He describes them as the filthiest of Allah's creatures. He is biased, but the details in his account align too closely with archaeological evidence to dismiss. Graves across Scandinavia contain multiple bodies showing signs of violent death, decapitation, trauma, inferior burial treatment. Elise Naumann at the University of Oslo analyzed skeletal remains from several Viking tombs, decapitated bodies. Not related to the primary burial through DNA testing, diet analysis shows they ate fish while their masters ate meat and dairy, signs of mistreatment on the bones. These were likely slaves killed at the funerals of their owners. The Isle of Man, Ballatier burial. A wealthy male Viking grave. In the same mound, a young female, killed by a savage blow to the top of her head. Her body mixed with cremated animal remains, unceremonious, no coffin, placed in rigor mortis. David Wilson, who excavated the site, called this human sacrifice, a rite familiar to the Viking world, but otherwise unknown in the British Isles. The woman was likely a slave, killed to accompany her master into death. Ridgeway Hill, Dorset, England, 54 decapitated bodies, all male, Scandinavian origin based on isotope analysis. Ages range from teens to 50s. 51 heads stacked separately, 3 heads missing. None show signs of battle wounds, not warriors. Some had teeth filed with grooves, a practice common among Viking men. This was not a battle. This was an execution, mass killing. Possibly captured Vikings executed by Anglo-Saxons. Possibly slaves killed for some unknown reason. The site remains contested, but the decapitations are clear. Human sacrifice happened. The frequency is debated. The ritual significance is debated, but the practice existed. And slaves were the primary victims, women especially. The poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems, includes Sigurdark Vida Hinskama. The Valkyrie Brynhildr gives instructions for the funeral of the hero Sigurd. 5 bondswomen shall follow him. 8 male slaves, well-born slaves. The poem specifies children who were gifts. This is not fringe practice described in horror. This is funerary instruction recorded in sacred literature. Slaves accompanying masters into death was expected, accepted, part of the religious framework. But most slaves did not die in funerals. Most lived, most worked, most were sold and resold through the networks that connected Scandinavia to the rest of the medieval world. Dublin was the western hub. From Dublin, captives went to Viking colonies in Britain, to Iceland, to Scandinavia. Some went east. The Rus traded with the Islamic world and Byzantium. Female slaves fetched high prices in the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. Young, attractive, light-skinned. These were premium goods. Arab sources confirm the trade. 977. Ibn Hawqal writes of Viking slaves reaching Egypt. The chain stretched from Irish coastal villages to the palaces of Cairo. The Rus operated with calculated efficiency, fortified trading posts. Novgorod, the street intersection where High Street met Slave Street. Archaeological evidence includes shackles and manacles once thought to be for animals, but now recognized as restraints for human captives. The trade was systematic, licensed. Scandinavian rulers issued raiding licenses, legal permission to capture people and sell them. This was not banditry. This was state-sanctioned enterprise. An 11th century cleric observed that a Viking who seized a new captive would without hesitation sell him to his comrades or barbarians as a slave. The casual phrase, without hesitation, reveals how normalized the practice was. The treatment of female slaves varied by status and purpose. A concubine to a wealthy jarl might live in relative comfort, better food than field workers, jewelry, clothing of higher quality than her station as a slave would normally allow, but she lived at the whim of her owner. No rights. No protection. Viking law codes are explicit. Thralls, the Old Norse word for slaves, owned nothing, not even their own time. Their bodies belonged to their masters. Sexual access was assumed. Gragas, the Icelandic law code compiled in the 12th century but reflecting earlier practices, states that a man could purchase a slave specifically for sexual purposes. This was legal, recorded, expected. Female thralls in the household performed domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, weaving, caring for children, farm work, grinding grain at the quern. The word cumul in Old Irish possibly derives from cumola, with a quern, the woman who grinds. Before watermills, grinding grain was punishing work, backbreaking, repetitive. Hours every day, slaves did this, women slaves especially. The Vita of St. Karen, 9th century, describes the saint as a slave to a king, forced to grind grain every day. Slave labor kept households running, but the psychological and physical toll was severe. Slaves had no legal recourse. A master could beat a slave, rape a slave, kill a slave. Irish law treated slaves as ambu, non-persons. No protection against being injured or killed. The Icelandic sagas give pejorative names to thralls: stinky, stumpy, stupid, dehumanizing language that reinforced their status as property. Some thralls could earn freedom. Manumission happened. Hard work over years might result in release, but freedom was not guaranteed. Some slaves were buried with their owners after serving them their entire lives. The DNA evidence from Iceland shows the long-term impact. 2/3 of the founding female population were Gaelic. Many of these women had children with Norsemen. Their descendants are modern Icelanders. But how many of these unions were consensual? How many of these Gaelic women were free when they bore children to Norse settlers? The genetic legacy is clear. The human cost is immeasurable. A 2018 study by researchers at the University of Iceland and Decode Genetics in Reykjavik analyzed ancient DNA. The conclusions match the historical record. Thousands of women, mostly from Ireland and Scotland, were transported to Iceland in the 9th and 10th centuries. Many were slaves. The study cannot determine exact numbers, but the genetic signal is unmistakable. Gaelic maternal lineages, Norse paternal lineages, the pattern repeats across Iceland. This was sexual slavery. The sagas romanticize it. Stories of exotic Irish princesses, beautiful captives who win the love of their captors. But the reality beneath the literary gloss was brutal. Forced displacement, forced labor, forced sexual relationships, no agency, no choice. And for those who resisted, the consequences were fatal. The Icelandic Book of Settlements records a revolt by Irish slaves in the early days of the colony. All the escapees were killed. Resistance was crushed. Not all slaves accepted their condition. A few escaped, 940. An Irish bishop held on Dalkey Island died trying to escape from Viking captors. 980, Mael Sechlain, king of the southern Uí Nail, stormed Dublin. He freed all the Irish slaves in the port. This was both charity and politics. Freeing slaves denied the Vikings economic power and rallied support across Ireland. Mael Sechlain positioned himself as a liberator. But most slaves never saw freedom. They lived and died as property. The archaeological record is sparse because slaves were invisible by design. Their movements were restricted. They owned no possessions. They were not given formal burials in most cases. When they died, they were buried in shallow graves or left unburied. The usual grave for a thrall was probably not much more than a hole in the ground, notes one scholar. They were buried in ways that ensured they could not return to haunt their masters. And they were buried in ways that indicated they could still serve their masters in the afterlife. Slavery did not end with death, but even invisibility leaves traces, dental grooves. About 1 in 25 male Viking burials in Sweden and Norway include teeth incised with deep horizontal grooves. For decades, Archaeologists thought these marked warrior status, but some of these men were decapitated and placed in graves with other men. Anna Kjellström at Stockholm University argues these were slaves ritually killed upon the death of their masters. The dental grooves may have marked them as slaves, or as a special class of slave. The evidence is contested, but the pattern is there. Decapitation, inferior burial, dietary differences, lack of kinship with the primary burial. These are the fingerprints of slavery in the grave. Women's graves show different patterns. Female slaves were rarely given weapon burials. No swords, no shields. But some female graves contain evidence of textile work. Spindle whorls, needles, weaving tools. This could indicate free women engaged in textile production, or it could mark skilled slave women whose labor was valuable enough to merit inclusion in death. The archaeology cannot always distinguish between a free woman of low status and a slave woman of high skill. Both might have similar grave goods. Both might be buried near the main household. The difference was legal status in life, and that does not always survive in bone and artifact. The treatment of noble women was particularly cruel because they fell the farthest. A peasant woman captured and enslaved experienced a loss of freedom, but not necessarily a loss of social status she had in abundance. A noble woman, a king's daughter, a chieftain's wife, these women had status. Wealth, education, respect. When they were captured, all of that was stripped away in an instant. The life of St. Findon mentions Findon's sister, taken by Vikings. She was from a noble family. Her fate after capture is not recorded. The sagas mention Irish princesses in Iceland. Some become concubines. Some regain status through children. But the initial act was enslavement, degradation, forced service. Noble women were also targets for ransom, but ransom was uncertain. If the family could pay, the woman might be returned. If negotiations failed, she might be killed or sold. The annals record high-status captives killed at the ships when ransom was not forthcoming. Bishops, abbots, noble women likely faced the same calculation, pay or lose her. And if the family was destroyed in the raid, if the father was killed and the lands burned, there was no one left to pay ransom. The woman became inventory. Monasteries were particular targets, not just for treasure, for people. Monks had some value as educated labor, scribes, literate men, but nuns were women. And women had the dual value of labor and sexual exploitation. Raids on monasteries in the 8th and 9th centuries captured not just religious artifacts, but the women inside. The Annals of Ulster describe raiders plundering monasteries and churches across Ireland. Armagh, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Kells. These were not just spiritual centers, they were populated settlements. When Vikings struck, everyone inside was vulnerable. The economic impact was staggering. Silver flowed into Scandinavia in unprecedented volume. Arab dirhams, Byzantine coins, Western European silver. The trade routes built on slavery enriched the Viking world. Towns like Hedeby and Birka expanded rapidly. Urbanization followed wealth, and the wealth came from selling people. The flow of silver also created demand for luxury goods, silk from Byzantium, spices from the Islamic world, weapons, jewelry. The slave trade was not an isolated practice. It was the foundation of a complex economic network that connected Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the Caspian Sea. But the human cost is incalculable. Thousands of women taken from their homes, transported across seas, sold in foreign markets, forced into labor, forced into sexual servitude, some killed in rituals, some buried alive with their masters, some worked to death. Some survived and bore children who carried Gaelic DNA into new populations. The genetic legacy remains. The lived experience is mostly lost. The voices of these women were never recorded. No chronicles written by slaves, no letters preserved. Only the marks they left on bones and DNA and the brief mentions in documents written by their captors or by distant observers like Ibn Fadlan. The Annals of Ulster preserve one phrase, 821, Howth, a great number of women into captivity. That phrase is repeated across the chronicles. Great numbers, many women, captivity. The scale was enormous. The practice was systematic. This was not the occasional raid gone wrong. This was an organized trade that persisted for centuries, from 793 Suers, Lindisfarne, the first recorded raid, to the 11th century, when Christianity and changing economics made the slave trade less profitable and less acceptable. 250 years, 10 generations. How many women? Tens of thousands, possibly more. The Annals of Ulster claim 3,000 people captured in a single raid in the early 10th century. If even a fraction of raids approached that scale, the total number is staggering. The trade began to decline in the 11th century. Viking societies were converting to Christianity. Enslaving fellow Christians became problematic. Not impossible, not forbidden entirely, but morally complicated in ways that pagan raiding was not. At the same time, the political landscape was changing. Irish kings consolidated power. English kingdoms pushed back. The Danelaw was absorbed. Viking settlements in Ireland were besieged. Dublin was stormed by Irish forces in 980. The slaves were freed. By the early 11th century, the great age of Viking raiding was ending. The settlements remained. The genetic legacy remained. But the massive slave networks were contracting. And what happened to the women? Most lived out their lives as slaves. They worked. They bore children. They died without names or memorials. A few escaped. A few were freed. A few bore children who became important figures in the sagas. But most were forgotten. The archaeological evidence shows they were there. The DNA evidence shows they survived long enough to pass on their genes. But their stories, their individual experiences, their voices, those are lost, except in the patterns, the iron collars in Dublin Harbor, the decapitated bodies in Scandinavian graves, the dental grooves and the fish-heavy diets, the Gaelic DNA in Iceland, the Arabic accounts of Viking slave markets, the Irish law codes that used female slaves as units of currency, the sagas that casually mentioned purchasing a concubine for 3 marks of silver. All of these are fragments, and when you assemble them, you see a system, a slave economy, and at the center of that economy, women, noble mothers, peasant daughters, nuns, captives pulled from burning villages and loaded onto ships. The title asks about noble mothers. The truth is worse. It was not just noble mothers. It was all of them. Nobility made you more valuable. It might get you better treatment or a higher price. But it did not save you. The annals record raids on royal households. The sagas mention Irish princesses. Nobility was a target because noble women had value as hostages, as symbols, as skilled, educated captives who could read and write and weave fine cloth. But when ransom failed, they became slaves like anyone else. 2019, Ben Raffield publishes findings in the journal Slavery and Abolition. He catalogs the evidence from decades of excavations, the shackles, the collar fragments, the grave patterns. He maps the trade routes, from Ireland to Iceland, from Slavic territories to Byzantium, from Scandinavia to Al-Andalus. The network is clear. The scale is undeniable. This was the largest slave trade in medieval Europe. And women were not a byproduct of that trade. They were the product. 2021. Cambridge Archaeological Journal publishes a reassessment of Ibn Fadlan's account. The article examines the ritual specialist called the Angel of Death, the woman who led the funeral rites, who held the dagger, who stabbed the slave girl repeatedly between the ribs. The article argues this woman had agency. She had power within the ritual framework. She was not a victim, but the slave girl was. The slave girl had no agency, no choice. She volunteered, but in a context where refusal was not possible, she was intoxicated, she was raped. She was killed, and the system that allowed this was built on centuries of normalized slavery. That is the answer to the question. What did Vikings do to noble mothers sold at slave markets? They did what every slave society does. They dehumanized, they commodified, they exploited, they raped, they killed, and they built an economy on it. An economy that enriched Scandinavia, that built Dublin and Hedeby and Birka, that left a genetic signature across the North Atlantic. That echoes in language. Slave from Slav, thrall from the Old Norse thrall. Even the phrase to be held in thrall, meaning to be under someone's power, comes from this history. The remains tell the final truth. Excavations at an early medieval site in Norway. A burnt structure, 1st century. People and animals immolated together. The human bodies left in the ruins, not retrieved for burial. Archaeologist Frans Herschend at Uppsala documented this in 2009. Evidence of slavery and human sacrifice predating the Viking Age. The practice has roots going back centuries. The Viking Age did not invent slavery. It industrialized it. It systematized it. It turned raiding into a business model. And then it ended. Not because Vikings became more humane, but because Christianity demanded it. Because the political order changed. Because the silver dried up. The trade routes shifted. The demand changed. By 1100 Njaro, the Viking Age was over. The settlements remained. The churches replaced the pagan temples. The slaves who survived became serfs or freemen over generations. But the scars remained. The genetic legacy. The skeletal evidence. The iron collars rusting in museum drawers. Dublin today. Trinity College Library holds the Annals of Ulster. 821. Howth. Great number of women. The ink is faded. The vellum is fragile. But the words are still there. And beneath the words, beneath the ground, beneath the modern city, are the foundations of the Viking settlement. The wharves where ships docked, the market squares where people were sold, the houses where they lived and worked and died. Archaeologists continue excavating, layer by layer, artifact by artifact, rebuilding the story of a city built on slavery. The question was about noble mothers, but the answer is about all of them. Every woman taken, every daughter stolen, every life reduced to a price in silver. Noble birth might have changed the price. It did not change the practice. 3 ounces of silver, 1 kamal. That was the value assigned to a human life by a legal system that saw no contradiction in measuring land, livestock, and women by the same standard. And Vikings, who have been mythologized as explorers and warriors, who are celebrated in sagas and modern media, built their expansion on this, on raiding, on taking, on selling. The genetic studies give us numbers but not names. 2/3 Gaelic, 1/3 Norse, female founding population of Iceland. But who were they? Which village did they come from? Did they have children they left behind? Did they ever see Ireland again? Did they die in Iceland dreaming of home? The DNA cannot tell us that. The archaeology cannot tell us that. We know they were there. We know they bore children. We know the children survived and passed on the genes, but the women themselves remain invisible. Shadows in the data, except for one detail, one archaeological site, one grave that shifts the context. A mass burial discovered near the White Sea, northern Russia. Grave goods match saga descriptions of a lost Norse expedition. 40 bodies, mixed with weapons and ship fittings. The grave has not been fully published. The research is ongoing, but preliminary reports suggest this was a Norse crew that did not return, killed, buried far from home. The sagas mention expeditions into these territories, some searching for trade routes, some searching for slaves. This grave may mark one of those failed expeditions, proof that the system did not only destroy the captives, it destroyed the captors too, but not at the same rate, not at the same scale. That is the cold truth at the end. The system sustained itself for centuries because it was profitable, because it worked, because the demand for slaves was constant and the supply was renewable. Raid the same coastal villages every few years. The population replenishes. Take the next generation. Sell them. Repeat. It only ended when external forces made it untenable. Christianity imposed moral costs. Political consolidation made raiding riskier. New trade goods replaced human cargo. The economics shifted. And then the practice faded. But it faded slowly. Slavery did not end abruptly in 1100. It transformed. Serfdom, indentured servitude, bonded labor. The legal status changed. The language changed. But the fundamental structure of coerced labor persisted for centuries after the Viking Age ended. The Viking slave trade was not an aberration. It was part of a continuum of human exploitation that runs through history. The specific practices were Viking, the iron collars, the ship burials, the funeral sacrifices. But the underlying logic was universal. Some people have power, some people do not. Those with power take, those without power lose. The question was sensational, more profane than you imagine, but the reality needs no embellishment. The annals of Ulster do not exaggerate. Ibn Fadlan does not exaggerate. The DNA does not lie. The iron collars do not lie. The decapitated remains in Viking graves do not lie. What happened to women in Viking slave markets was exactly what happens in any slave market: dehumanization. Commodification, violence, exploitation, sexual abuse, forced labor, and for some, death in rituals designed to serve masters even beyond the grave. That is the documented truth. That is what the evidence shows. That is the story the bones tell when you excavate the harbor at Dublin, or open a burial mound on the Isle of Man, or analyze the DNA of Icelanders whose ancestors include women taken from Howth in 821, 2025. We are further from these events than those events were from the fall of Rome, but the evidence remains. The collars, the graves, the genes, and the single line in the annals, a great number of women into captivity. That line is repeated in chronicle after chronicle, raid after raid. Year after year, a great number, many women, captivity. For 250 years, that was the pattern. And at the end of it, Scandinavia was richer. Ireland was scarred. Iceland was populated. And thousands of women whose names we will never know left their DNA in populations across the North Atlantic. That is the legacy. Not saga heroes, not dragon-proud ships cutting through fog, not even the monasteries burning. The legacy is this: women taken, women sold, women used, women discarded, and a system that made that practice normal, legal, profitable, and sustainable for 10 generations. That is what Vikings did. That is what the evidence proves.